Lena had been working in the billionaire's mansion for almost 6 months, but even after all that time, most people still treated her like she was invisible. She moved quietly from room to room, dusting shelves, folding clothes, polishing glass tables, and arranging everything with gentle care. She was young, but her face carried a calm maturity that came from responsibility, not age. Every day began early for her. Before the sun even rose, she would wake up in the small servants' quarters behind the mansion. The room was tiny, barely enough space for her bed and a small wooden table, but she never complained. She would fold her blanket neatly, wash her face with cool water, and tie her hair back. Then she would step outside, take a deep breath, and start her work. The billionaire's mansion was enormous, almost like a palace. The floors were polished marble that reflected the lights above like water. Expensive paintings hung on every wall, and the chandeliers sparkled even when no one was looking. But for Lena, the place never felt warm. It felt like a museum, beautiful but distant. She often wondered what kind of person needed so much space when one heart could only feel so much. The billionaire himself was known all around the city. He was powerful, sharp-tongued, and used to people agreeing with him before he even finished speaking. Whenever he walked through the house, servants rushed to clear the path, afraid of getting in his way. He never really looked at them. He looked past them, as if they were simply part of the furniture. Lena didn't mind the silence or the lack of attention. She only cared about sending money home. Her family lived far away, in a small village where life was simple but difficult. Her mother was sick, her siblings were young, and Lena had become the main support for everyone. That thought kept her going, even on the hardest days. Every evening, when she was done with work, Lena would sit by her small window and read. She never told anyone about her books. They were her treasure. Some were about languages, others about culture, and a few about history. Her favorite ones were the ones written in Arabic. She felt comfort whenever she read them, as if she were revisiting an old part of her life. Her life had not always been like this. There was a time, years ago, when she lived in a different country with her father. He worked there as a technician, and during those years, Lena went to a school filled with children from different cultures. That was where she learned Arabic. Not just learned it, but mastered it. Her teachers once said her accent sounded native. But life had changed quickly after her father passed away. Her family returned home and struggled financially. School became a luxury they couldn't afford. Lena had to start working. She accepted that reality quietly, never letting bitterness grow in her heart. Inside the mansion, however, no one knew anything about her past. They saw a maid, nothing more, and Lena never corrected them. She didn't feel the need to prove anything. The billionaire often held large gatherings. Investors, diplomats, business partners, and wealthy guests from around the world visited his home. On those nights, the house felt even bigger, filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations in several languages. Lena moved through the crowd silently, carrying trays of drinks, adjusting flowers, and making sure everything looked perfect. The guests barely noticed her. That was normal. But the billionaire noticed her in a different way, not with respect, but with a hint of amusement. To him, she was just another servant to show off in front of his guests, just another reminder of his wealth. He enjoyed making jokes at the expense of the staff, believing it made him appear powerful or entertaining. On one particular evening, a special group of guests arrived, wealthy businessmen from an Arabic-speaking country. They were partners in a major project the billionaire wanted to secure. He needed to impress them. The mansion was sparkling, the food was extravagant, and the music was soft and elegant. But the guests didn't seem entirely satisfied. They whispered among themselves, making comments that only someone who understood Arabic could fully grasp. The billionaire did not understand a word they said, but he laughed along politely, pretending he understood everything. His smile was wide but strained. He knew that if he failed to impress these guests, he might lose a very profitable deal. Lena, meanwhile, moved around with her tray, offering drinks. He didn't look at the guests directly, but she heard every word, their thoughts about the food being too bland, their confusion about the billionaire's behavior, and their irritation at how he kept interrupting them. She understood all of it perfectly, but she kept her head down. It wasn't her place to speak. The billionaire, however, noticed the guests' expressions and grew desperate to lighten the mood. In his attempt to entertain them, he scanned the room and saw Lena standing quietly at the side. A mischievous smile curved on his lips. He raised his hand and called her loudly, "You there, come forward." Lena froze for a second, surprised, but she stepped toward him respectfully. Everyone's eyes shifted to her. The billionaire turned to his guests and said in a joking tone, "She doesn't understand much, but she can say hello at least. Let's see if she can greet you." A few of the guests exchanged amused glances. They thought it would be funny to. Lena felt her cheeks grow warm. She didn't like attention, especially not like this. She wasn't angry, but she felt embarrassed. She wondered why she was being used as a joke. The billionaire leaned back in his chair smugly. "Go on," he said, still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Say something." Lena lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking. Inside her chest, quiet strength stirred, not anger, not pride, just a sense of dignity. She had spent months being invisible. She had accepted silence as her shield, but this moment felt different. This moment felt unfair. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She spoke in fluent, beautifully accented Arabic. Every word was clear, smooth, perfect. The entire room went silent. The guests blinked, stunned. One of them almost dropped his glass. The billionaire's smile froze on his face, slowly melting into shock. Lena continued speaking calmly, offering a respectful greeting and adding a few polite phrases the guests recognized as something only a well-educated speaker would know. It took only a few seconds, but those seconds changed everything. The guests looked at her with new eyes. One leaned forward, amazed. Another whispered to his friend, impressed by her command of the language. Their faces lit up with genuine respect. And the billionaire, he sat perfectly still, as if someone had removed his voice. He had tried to make a joke, but the joke had turned on him. Lena finished her greeting, bowed her head politely, and stepped back. Her heart was beating fast, but her expression stayed composed. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to embarrass the billionaire. She was simply being honest, revealing a part of herself she had kept hidden. The atmosphere in the room changed. The guests were suddenly warmer, more engaged, and more curious. They began whispering things like, "Where did she learn?" and "Her accent is perfect." Some even looked annoyed at the billionaire for assuming she didn't understand anything. The billionaire, red-faced and speechless, forced a stiff smile. He had no idea how to recover from that moment. But the night wasn't over, and neither was the story. This was only the beginning of how a quiet maid, with knowledge hidden in her heart, turned the tables on a man who thought he knew everything. The next morning arrived with a quiet breeze, moving through the tall palm trees surrounding the mansion. The sun had not risen completely, and the air carried that soft calmness that only early mornings can bring. Inside the kitchen, the maid, everyone simply called the quiet girl, was already at work. Her hands moved calmly as she sorted fresh vegetables, carefully washed them, and prepared the breakfast trays for the house staff who would soon wake up. She always liked starting her day early because it gave her time to think. The previous night's dinner had stayed in her mind. She kept hearing the billionaire's voice, loud and proud, as he joked about her in front of his guests. She kept hearing the laughter that followed, the way eyes turned to her as if she belonged to another world, a smaller one. But she also kept hearing the silence that came after she answered him in fluent Arabic. That silence had felt powerful. It had felt like she had stepped into a place where they didn't expect her to stand. She didn't know what would happen now. She didn't know if the billionaire was angry or surprised or simply confused. But she knew one thing clearly: she hadn't spoken to show off. She had spoken because no one deserved to be spoken to like that. Not even the quiet girl who cleaned their floors. By the time the clock touched 8, the house slowly came alive. Soft footsteps echoed in the hallway, drawers opened and closed, and the smell of coffee drifted around the rooms. The kitchen door swung open, and the house supervisor stepped inside. She was older, calm, and understanding, one of the few people who always treated the girl kindly. She looked at her with soft eyes and said gently, "The owner wants to see you." The girl froze. The knife in her hand slipped slightly but didn't fall. Her heart felt heavy for a moment. She quietly nodded and wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't expect this so soon. A part of her wondered if he might send her away. Another part wondered if he simply wanted to question her out of curiosity. She followed the supervisor through the hallways, walking softly, keeping her eyes on the ground the way she always did. But her mind was racing. She took a deep breath before entering the room. The billionaire was sitting on a wide leather chair near the large windows, looking outside at his garden. The sunlight fell across the room in straight golden lines, making his office look like a place where decisions were made every minute. He didn't turn when she walked in. He simply said, "Close the door." She closed it gently. After a moment, he finally turned his head toward her. His expression was strange, not angry, not pleased, but curious in a way she didn't quite understand. He studied her face the way someone studies something that doesn't match their expectations. "So," he began slowly, "you speak Arabic?" She nodded politely. "Yes, sir." "Fluent Arabic," he added. She nodded again. She didn't know if she should explain more or stay quiet. Silence felt safer, so she stayed silent. He leaned back in his chair, and something close to confusion crossed his face. Why didn't you ever say anything before? She met his eyes for a second, then looked away. Sir, I wasn't asked, and it wasn't needed for my work. He tapped his fingers on the desk as if trying to understand the situation better. Where did you learn it? My father worked in an Arabic-speaking country for many years, she explained softly. I grew up there. It was my first language. The billionaire blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected that at all. He had assumed she came from a poor village and had learned only enough basic words to understand instructions. He had never imagined she carried another world inside her, a world she didn't show anyone. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. You know, last night you embarrassed me. Her breath caught in her chest. She lowered her head at once. I'm sorry, sir. I did not mean… No, he interrupted. Not embarrassed like that. He paused, thinking carefully. You made me look foolish. You made me realize I judged you without knowing anything about you. She didn't say a word. She simply waited. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. The billionaire sighed. I shouldn't have said what I said yesterday. It was unkind. For a moment she didn't know what to do. She had never expected an apology, especially not from someone who ran a world of money and power. She carefully said, It's all right, sir. He shook his head slightly. It's not all right. Then he straightened in his chair and looked at her again. Listen, I want to ask you something important. Her hands tightened slightly around the sides of her apron. I host a large business meeting every year, he said. Many people from the Middle East attend. They prefer speaking Arabic. I usually hire translators, but sometimes it causes delays or mistakes. He paused. Could you help with translation this year? The girl blinked in surprise. She had not expected this. She looked at him, unsure if she heard correctly. Me, sir. I'm just a maid. Yes, but you speak the language better than most translators I've met, he replied. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her breath felt stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to say. A part of her felt honored, another part scared, and another part wondered if he was testing her. You won't have to do anything you don't want, he added. If you're not comfortable, just say so, but I want you to think about it. She looked down at her hands and slowly nodded. I can help, sir, if you really want me to. His tone softened slightly. Good, we'll talk again soon. She bowed her head politely and stepped out of the room. The moment the door closed behind her, her heart finally relaxed. Her legs felt weak for a second, and she leaned against the cool wall, trying to breathe normally again. She didn't know where her life was heading, but she felt something shifting, something she had never expected. As she walked back toward the kitchen, the staff whispered to each other. They had seen her going into the owner's office. Some wondered if she was in trouble. Others wondered if she would be fired. But when they saw her expression calm, almost thoughtful, they grew confused. She didn't look upset or scared. She looked different. One of the younger workers asked her quietly, Are you all right? She nodded gently. Yes, everything is fine. But inside, she was thinking about the moment she spoke in front of the guests. She remembered the shock in the billionaire's eyes. She remembered the way the room froze. And she remembered something else, the strength she felt when she used her voice. Later that day, the billionaire stepped out of his office to review a few things in the main hall. As he walked, his friends from the dinner party arrived to meet him. They still remembered the moment from last night, and some started joking again, but this time their jokes held less confidence. After seeing him so silent last night, they didn't know what he had thought about it afterward. One friend nudged him lightly and said, So, about your maid. That was unexpected, wasn't it? The billionaire didn't laugh. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly and said, She's more capable than you think. The friend raised an eyebrow. Really? She speaks Arabic fluently, the billionaire said firmly, and she will be helping with my annual meeting. The friend blinked and then let out a low whistle. Well, didn't expect that. The billionaire didn't reply. He kept walking, his face calm, but his thoughts were busy. He kept replaying the moment from last night in his mind. He realized how easily he had judged someone who carried so much knowledge. Meanwhile, downstairs, the maid returned to her tasks. Her movements were gentle but steady, her mind full of thoughts. She wasn't thinking about revenge or pride. She simply felt relieved that someone had finally seen something more in her than just the work she did. That night, she sat on her small bed in the staff quarters, looking at the quiet room. She whispered to herself softly, Maybe this is the beginning of something new. She didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a little hope, a feeling she thought she had lost long ago. The next week moved quietly inside the mansion, but something had changed. Something small, invisible, yet powerful. The billionaire had begun noticing details he had never paid attention to before. He watched the quiet girl from a distance sometimes, not in a rude way, but in a thoughtful one. He watched how she moved around the house with calm discipline, how she greeted everyone softly, how she never wasted a minute, and how she carried a strange mixture of humility and confidence that didn't match her position. The staff felt the difference too. They weren't sure what happened in the owner's office the previous morning, but they sensed something important. The girl who used to be ignored or forgotten now walked through the halls with people glancing at her in curiosity. They weren't rude, just curious. They wanted to understand why the owner seemed to treat her differently. She continued her work as usual, sweeping the hallway floors, making the beds, dusting the large furniture, and helping in the kitchen. But there was something new inside her too, something she couldn't hide even if she tried. It was a kind of quiet hope. She had always believed her life was fixed, cleaning, serving, surviving, but now, a small doorway had opened in her imagination, a doorway that made her wonder, what if, one afternoon while she was folding linens in the laundry room, the owner's assistant came to find her. He was polite and formal, holding a small folder in his hands. "The owner wants to see you again," he said. She paused mid-fold, her fingers pressing the soft cloth. Her heart beat a little faster. She nodded and followed him upstairs. This time, she didn't feel scared. She felt prepared, still nervous, maybe, but stronger than before. When she entered the office, the billionaire was standing near the bookshelf, going through some documents. He looked up when he heard the door. "Ah, good," he said. "Come in." She stepped forward slowly. "I've been thinking," he began, placing the papers on the desk. "If you're going to help with translation, you'll need some training. The meeting is important, and I want everything to go smoothly." She nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." He picked up a folder, the same one the assistant had carried. "These are notes from last year's meeting. Things discussed, documents shared, the topics they prefer. You don't have to memorize everything right now, but I want you to get familiar with the type of conversations that will happen." Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the folder. No one had ever given her something like this before, something official, something that meant she was trusted with responsibility. The billionaire watched her carefully. "I also want to make sure you're comfortable speaking in front of people. Guests from the Middle East can be very formal, and they'll expect clear communication." She nodded again. Her voice came out soft but steady. "I understand, sir. I will do my best." He studied her for a moment. "Where did you learn to speak so clearly? Your accent is nearly native." She smiled a little, something she rarely did. "I grew up around people who only spoke Arabic. I learned their words before I learned many others." He nodded slowly, impressed again. "Good, then you'll be fine." She lowered her head politely and turned to leave, but he added, "And thank you for agreeing to do this." She paused, surprised. "You don't need to thank me, sir." "I do," he said quietly. "You stepped into something new without hesitation." She gave a small, respectful nod and left the room, clutching the folder to her chest. As she walked down the hallway, she felt something warm spreading inside her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. Someone believed she could do more. Someone saw more in her than chores and cleaning. That simple realization made her steps lighter. That evening, after finishing her daily duties, she sat in her small room and opened a folder. Inside were pages of formal documents, notes, printed emails, and handwritten lines from past meetings. She read slowly, trying to understand every word. Some terms were difficult, related to business and investment, but she didn't give up. She whispered the Arabic translations under her breath, matching them with the English meanings. Hours passed like minutes. When she finally stopped reading, the night was deep and quiet. She placed the folder beside her pillow and lay down. She closed her eyes, but her mind was wide awake, replaying every part of her day. She wondered if she truly belonged in a place like this, between business documents and important meetings. But then she remembered the way the billionaire had spoken to her, serious, respectful, trusting. That thought helped her fall asleep with calmness. Over the next few days, the billionaire asked her to visit his office several times. Each time they practiced short conversations in Arabic. He would read a sentence from a paper in English, and she would translate it smoothly. Sometimes he tested her with complex sentences, financial discussions, negotiation phrases, or cultural greetings. She answered them one by one with surprising confidence. That at first he only focused on her translations. But slowly, without even noticing it, he began paying attention to something else: the way she carried herself. The way she stayed composed even when something was confusing. The way her voice stayed soft yet steady. She had a kind of quiet dignity that he had never taken the time to notice. One morning, while she was in the kitchen arranging breakfast trays, the assistant came again. "The owner wants you upstairs," he said. She washed her hands and followed him. When she entered the office this time, she saw 3 men sitting with the billionaire. They wore formal suits and held documents in their hands. Their expressions were serious but curious when she walked in. The billionaire gestured toward her. "This is the one I told you about. Show them." She froze for a second. She hadn't expected an audience. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. One of the men spoke in Arabic, testing her gently. She responded flawlessly. The second man asked her something more complicated. She answered with confidence. The third man smiled and asked her a cultural phrase that only native speakers used. Her answer made all 3 men look at each other in surprise. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, a small, proud smile on his face. "I wasn't exaggerating." The men nodded, impressed. After they finished, one of them said in Arabic, "She is better than many professional translators we've met." The girl lowered her eyes, humbled. She didn't know what to do with such praise. She had never been praised by important people before. The billionaire thanked them, and they left the room. When the door closed, he turned to her. "You did well." She breathed out slowly. "Thank you, sir. From now on," he said, "you'll attend all practice sessions with the team." She nodded politely. Then she left the office with a quiet smile on her face. Downstairs, some of the staff noticed the smile. They exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew one thing. The quiet girl was no longer invisible. She had stepped into a world far larger than the one she had known. Later that night, she sat by the small window in her room. The moonlight shone gently across her bed. She held the practice sheets in her hands but didn't read them right away. Instead, she looked outside at the dark sky, thinking. She had always believed that growing up poor meant paths were closed. She believed her past defined her, and her work would always stay the same. But now she could feel something shifting, something opening, something rising. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe my life can be more than I imagined." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The days moved quickly, and the annual meeting grew closer. Each sunrise felt like a small countdown, reminding the quiet girl that something important was waiting ahead. She still woke up early every morning and did her usual chores of sweeping, washing, organizing, and helping in the kitchen. But those chores no longer felt like her whole world. They were simply a part of her day. Because now, after finishing her work, she would sit in the owner's office or in the quiet corner of the library, practicing translations with documents spread in front of her. The staff noticed the change. They whispered among themselves in soft, curious tones. "The owner called her again," someone would say. Another would reply, "She must be doing something important." But no one knew the full truth. No one knew how much she was learning, how much she was practicing, or how deeply the billionaire had begun trusting her. The meeting was only a week away. The house felt busier than usual. Workers cleaned every corner, extra security staff arrived, and high-end catering teams visited to plan the food. Expensive cars came and went from the front gate. Phone calls echoed through the hallways. Everything felt louder, faster, more serious. One morning, while she arranged freshly washed dishes in the kitchen, the owner's assistant walked in. He looked slightly stressed, holding a schedule in his hands. "The owner wants to speak with you," he said quickly. She wiped her hands and followed him. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear anymore but with anticipation. When she entered the office, the billionaire was sitting with 2 event coordinators. Maps of the meeting hall lay spread across the table. Microphone setups, guest seating charts, and translation booths were marked in colored lines. He looked up when she entered. "Good, come in." She stepped forward politely and waited. "We're finalizing arrangements for the meeting," he said. "I want you to understand how everything will work." She listened carefully as he explained. The guests from different countries would sit in assigned areas. Each conversation would happen in English or Arabic, depending on preference. She would sit at a small table near the front, not hidden in the back, not behind a curtain, but visible and trusted. She felt her breath catch for a moment. She had never imagined sitting anywhere near the front of a meeting attended by wealthy and powerful people. The billionaire noticed her expression and softened his tone. "You'll be fine. You've done excellent work so far." She nodded quietly, grateful for the reassurance. One of the coordinators looked at her with interest. "Has she translated for such a large group before?" The billionaire answered before she could speak. "She's more capable than most." The coordinator nodded, impressed. When the meeting ended, the billionaire handed her a thick envelope. "These are the final documents. Go through them when you can. She held the envelope gently. Yes, sir, I will. Later that night, in her small room, she opened the envelope carefully. Inside were pages filled with detailed business discussions. She read slowly, taking her time, repeating each line in Arabic to herself. Some parts were simple, some were difficult, but she didn't give up. She read until the words no longer felt like strangers to her. By the time she finished, the moon was high in the sky. She lay back on her bed and closed her eyes. She felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes when someone is working towards something meaningful. Morning arrived again, but this morning was different. It was the day of the meeting. The entire house buzzed with energy. Workers rushed from room to room, arranging last-minute details. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Guests began arriving one by one, dressed in formal clothes and carrying polished briefcases. She stood in the hallway, holding her translation folder, feeling her hands tremble slightly. She breathed deeply, reminding herself of everything she had practiced. You can do this, she whispered to herself. A staff member guided her toward the meeting hall. When she entered, her eyes widened. The room looked nothing like the quiet mansion she had grown used to. Rows of chairs were arranged in perfect lines. Soft lights shone along the ceiling. On the main stage, the billionaire stood greeting his guests, shaking hands and speaking confidently. When he saw her enter, he gave a small nod, subtle but reassuring. She walked to her assigned seat at the front. Her heart thumped loudly, but she kept her face calm. People glanced at her, curious. They didn't know who she was. She didn't look like a translator. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a business meeting. But she sat down quietly and opened her folder. Soon the room filled completely. There were executives, investors, business partners, and high-level guests from several countries. The meeting began with a welcome speech. The billionaire stood at the podium, thanking everyone for attending. Then came the moment she had prepared for. One of the guests standing near the stage asked a long question in Arabic. The words flowed quickly and smoothly, complicated and formal. The room fell silent. Everyone waited for someone to translate it. The billionaire turned his eyes toward her. It was her cue. She stood up slowly, feeling every heartbeat in her chest. Then she translated the entire question in clear, confident English. Not a single word hesitated. Not a single phrase felt unsure. The audience turned their heads, shocked. The billionaire smiled slightly. He already knew she could do it. Another guest spoke, this time in a thicker accent. She translated again, lean, accurate, easy. Murmurs filled the room. People leaned toward one another, whispering. They had never expected such fluent Arabic from a young woman who looked like part of the house staff. One guest raised his hand and said loudly in Arabic, "Where did she learn to speak like this?" The billionaire answered with pride in his voice, "She grew up in an Arabic-speaking country." The guest nodded, impressed. "She speaks better than some of my employees." She felt her cheeks warm, but she kept working. As the meeting continued, she translated question after question, sometimes to English, sometimes back to Arabic. The conversations flowed smoothly. There were no misunderstandings, no delays, no awkward pauses. She kept her voice steady, her hands calm, her eyes focused. Halfway through the meeting, the billionaire leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "You're doing excellent." She lowered her eyes respectfully. "Thank you, sir." By the end of the meeting, nearly everyone in the room knew her face. Many guests shook her hand on their way out. Some complimented her in Arabic, thanking her for her skill. Others praised her clarity and calmness. One older guest said warmly, "You have a gift. I hope you use it well." She bowed her head gratefully. Finally, after hours of translating, the room began to empty. The billionaire stayed near the front, shaking hands with the last few guests. When they left, he turned to her. "You made this meeting better than any we've had," he said. "I'm proud of you." Her eyes softened. "I'm glad I could help." He looked at her for a moment, and his expression changed, no longer the expression of a wealthy man speaking to a worker. It was the expression of someone seeing another human being clearly, with respect. "You're more than the job you were hired for," he said quietly. "Don't ever forget that." She felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, sir." That night, she returned to her room feeling a sense of joy she had never felt before. She sat on her bed, holding the translation folder gently in her hands. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a maid, not as a worker, not as someone invisible, but as someone capable, someone valuable, someone who had a future. And as she closed her eyes to rest, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is just the beginning."